In this lesson, we are going to learn all about voltaic cells, and I'm going to draw out and diagram out what really happens in a voltaic cell. So, an electrochemical cell is a device capable of either generating electricity from a chemical reaction or consuming electricity to cause a chemical reaction. And there are two types of electrochemical cells, the one that generates electricity and the one that consumes electricity. So this lesson is all about voltaic or galvanic cells. And voltaic cells are the ones that produce electricity. So a voltaic cell or galvanic cell produces electricity. And it produces the electricity from a spontaneous chemical reaction. And hopefully you remember that a spontaneous chemical reaction is one that occurs on its own. It occurs without any outside help. So it's one that wants to occur. So a voltaic cell produces electricity from a reaction that occurs by itself. So electricity is produced in a voltaic cell. Now, if we were to compare this to the other type of cell, which is called an electrolytic cell is one that consumes electricity, and it consumes it so that it can cause a non-spontaneous chemical reaction to occur. So a non-spontaneous chemical reaction needs a little help, and it gets it from the electricity that it consumes during the reaction. So that's what you'd find in an electrolytic cell, is a non-spontaneous chemical reaction that is carried out because it is supplied with electricity. So in this video, we are just going to be focusing on the voltaic cell. So here we go. We are going to start out with two beakers just sitting there on a lab bench, not filled with anything yet, but I'll let you know what we'll be putting in those. So this will be a diagram of a voltaic cell. Now in beaker number 1, we are going to put a 1 molar solution of zinc nitrate. Now this is a solution, it's an aqueous solution, so I'm going to draw a little aqueous a little water line there because most of it's going to be water. But if we were to put a 1 molar solution in this beaker, we would have some zinc ions, and I'll draw 3 zinc ions here. And if we draw or represent 3 zinc ions, we are going to need to draw and represent 6 nitrate anions. So I'll draw those 6 nitrate anions. And the reason that we're drawing these separate is because zinc nitrate is dissolved in the solution. It's soluble in water. Now on the right hand side, we're going to have a 1 molar solution of copper 2 nitrate. So I'm going to represent the copper 2 nitrate here. Copper 2 nitrate is a sort of a bluish color solution, so I'm actually going to represent this in a sort of bluish way, but it's blue because the copper ions are blue, not because of the nitrate. Otherwise, our zinc nitrate solution would be blue as well. It's blue because copper 2 plus ions have sort of a blue hue to them. So I'm going to represent those copper 2 ions in blue, and then the nitrate ions that were stuck to them all still dissolved, we'll represent those in black because there's not really anything spectacular about the color of those anions. So we have 2 beakers with 2 solutions in them. Now to the left-hand beaker, I'm going to add a long, thin strip of zinc metal. So this is zinc metal. Notice how there's no charge on it. And we're going to kind of just really quickly list here the 2 forms of zinc in this beaker. We have zinc metal, which is a solid, and it's a neutral metal. It's shiny, silvery, conducts electricity, and it's a solid metal. Now zinc 2 plus is in aqueous solution, and it's a soluble ion, and you'll see it floating around there in the solution. Now you can't really see it, but we're representing it floating around there in the solution. Those are the 2 forms of zinc we have in the left-hand beaker. So zinc solid is a neutral metal, zinc 2 plus is a soluble ion. In the right-hand beaker, I'm going to draw a long, thin strip of copper metal. Now copper is usually kind of a brownish color, but I'll use this sort of dark red to represent copper. So this is copper. Now copper in solid form is kind of like that brownish color. It's shiny, and it's a neutral metal. So when it's in its neutral form, It is a coppery metal, like a penny, what you would imagine a strip of copper looking like, sort of a penny, because pennies are coated in copper. Now, copper 2 plus, this is a soluble ion. So it's blue, and it's soluble, and it's an ion floating around in the solution. So you need to know the difference between the neutral form of these metals and the ionic form of these metals, because that's going to make a huge difference when we start hooking up our cell. So as these two beakers sit, nothing is happening to them. Nothing will happen to them. The zinc metal and the zinc ions are floating around. The metal and the copper ions are floating around the copper, but nothing's really happening. If we wanted something to happen, we would combine all of these things together, and copper 2 plus would just steal those electrons right away from zinc. But it can't do that until we hook up a wire connecting the two. So copper is calling over to zinc and saying, I need some electrons. You got any electrons for me? And zinc's like, hey, I can give them to you, but only if we hook up a wire between us, because those electrons need to pass through something in order to get to you. So copper's like, all right, we hook up this wire, and now the electrons enter that copper metal strip. And when they do that, that attracts the copper 2 plus ions in that solution to the electrons, because positives attract to negatives. The nitrate ions don't want anything to do with the electrons, but those copper 2 plus ions, those want to be near those electrons. They're attracted. So what happens when we take a copper 2 plus ion and we give it 2 electrons? Well, what happens is we get neutral copper. So copper 2 plus 2 electrons is neutral copper. That 2 plus ion goes away. The electrons go away, kind of. We're not going to represent them anymore. And what happens is we have a little tiny atom of copper added to the outside of this metal piece. So just to kind of take a step back and look at what happened in a macroscopic scale here, the copper metal piece got bigger. It got more massive because now it has an extra atom of copper on it. The solution that was very blue is just slightly less blue because it lost a copper 2 plus ion. So that's what's happening on the copper side of this beaker. Now, the copper side had to get the electrons from somewhere, and that copper side got the electrons. They traveled through the wire, but they came from the zinc side, and they came from the metallic zinc side. So that metallic zinc, that neutral zinc, gave up 2 electrons. And when it gives up 2 electrons, we'll write this reaction. When zinc gives up those 2 electrons, it becomes zinc with a positive 2 charge, and then the 2 electrons are there that it gave up. So we have this kind of opposite sort of reaction taking place. Now, when zinc metal loses its 2 electrons, it becomes a soluble ion, and it leaves that metal space. So now that zinc metal got a little bit smaller. That hunk of zinc metal got a little bit smaller because now there are more zinc ions floating around in that beaker. So there are more zinc ions floating around in the beaker, and the zinc metal got smaller. So this is what happens on a microscopic and a macroscopic scale to this cell. Now we're going to add a few more things to this and show you some more things. But the copper side of this is the reduction side. So remember, gain electrons is reduction. So the copper 2 plus gained an electron, and that makes this the reduction side. This in a voltaic cell is the cathode side, or the positive side. The zinc side is the one that lost electrons, or the anode side, the negative side. So oxidation is losing electrons, and reduction is gaining electrons. So those are the two sides of our equation. Now, what happens if we let this run longer? We're going to lose all of the copper 2 plus ions on the copper side, and eventually that copper piece of metal will get bigger and bigger and bigger and coated with more and more and more copper metal. And on the left, if we let this run longer and longer and longer, what's going to happen is the zinc metal is eventually going to slowly sort of dissolve. It's not really going to dissolve, but it's slowly going to disappear because the zinc metal atoms are going to turn into soluble zinc ions, and this beaker is going to get full of zinc ions. And it's going to continue filling and filling up with zinc ions as that metal kind of slowly disappears and turns from metallic zinc to ionic zinc. Now this is all fine and dandy, except the fact that electricity does not like a buildup of charge. So we need one more part of this voltaic cell, and that is the salt bridge. Now, a salt bridge usually consists of a glass tube filled with an electrolyte or an electrolyte gel and possibly some sort of cotton or wool blocking the barrier so to prevent mixing. We are going to put sodium nitrate in our salt bridge. And what's going to happen is that sodium nitrate is going to dissolve, or it's in sort of a solution in our salt bridge, and the sodium ions are going to travel toward that buildup of negative charge because the sodium is attracted to the negative side. So the sodium ions are going to balance that negative charge on the right. And the nitrate ions, the negative nitrate ions, are going to go through there and travel toward the positive side that has built up that positive charge because of all of those zinc ions. So the purpose of the salt bridge is to balance out the charges. It's an electrolyte solution or gel that connects the two solutions to balance out the charges and really just complete the electrical circuit that we have going on here. Otherwise, we just have a buildup of charge on one side, buildup of negative charge on the right here, and a buildup of positive charge on the left. Now, the last thing that we can really do with this voltaic cell is we can literally measure the voltage of this cell using a voltmeter. Now, this specific cell would have a voltage of 1.10 volts. If it were in standard conditions, it would have a voltage of 1.10 volts between the copper and the zinc. And we could measure that. We could measure the movement of those electrons and measure that as 1.10 volts. One other thing I want to mention at the end here is cell notation. We can actually represent this entire whole thing, this whole contraption, in very simple notation. And that is recording what we start with and end with on the oxidation side. So we start with zinc in solid form, separated by a line that separates the two phases. We end with zinc 2+ in aqueous form. Then we have a double line to show the barriers between the oxidation and reduction side. And then on the reduction side, we have copper 2+ ion turning into copper solid. And those two phases are separated by a single line. So you can represent the entire voltaic cell using this cell notation.